Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit outside of my normal wheelhouse, taking a look at a Sumerian myth called Enki Ninhursaja. Not even sure if I'm saying that correctly. There's a few different variations of that name. But the text I'm using to work from is from the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, which I will link to in the description if you want to check that out. It's been a while since I've worked with any text outside of the biblical canon. The last one I did was from Enoch, although technically Enoch is part of the Ethiopian canon, but it's been a few years since I wrote that blog post. So I wanted to take a look at the Sumerian myth because I was curious to see, did the Sumerians use the same propaganda techniques that the biblical writers used? And the answer to that is yes. If you'd like to learn more about the biblical propaganda techniques that the biblical writers used, you can check out my blog post called Biblical Propaganda 101, which I will link to that in the description as well. So, as propaganda, the Sumerian writers were taking elements from an oral tradition about the gods of Dilmun and then putting those elements into a new context in order to change their meaning and promote their own agenda. And what they seem to be doing in this particular text is repositioning the god Enki as the top deity of Dilmun, or at least the originator of the goddesses of Dilmun. To be honest, I'm not even sure if Enki was a native god of Dilmun and may have been wholly imported from somewhere else. The first propaganda technique that I want to talk about is what I refer to as gene splicing. In the Bible, this is typically done with a kingly line. For instance, Saul wasn't really the son of Kish, but he was injected into the line of Kish. David wasn't actually the son of Jesse, but he was injected into the line of Jesse. And Solomon wasn't actually the son of David, but was injected into the Davidic line. And now may be a good time to mention that some of the things I talk about, you may be wondering where I come up with it from. And obviously talking about all of these things in detail is beyond the scope of this video. But my conclusion is based on the reconstructions of the oral traditions behind the biblical text. If you want to learn more about that, be sure to check out the rest of the videos on my YouTube channel, or you can check out my website at reconstructedbible.com. Continuing about gene splicing, biblical authors resurrect dead sons in order to inject tribes into a bloodline. Isaac had died when Abraham sacrificed him, but this part of the story is erased by the biblical author, and Isaac is essentially resurrected, and Israel is injected into the line of Abraham. Joseph had died from wild animals, but the biblical author resurrects him in order to inject Ephraim and Manasseh. A variation of gene splicing is incestuous relationships. A prominent example of this is Lot and his two daughters. The biblical author emphasizes that the daughters had not had any relationships with a man. By impregnating them with Lot, it ensures that their bloodlines do not originate with anyone outside of Lot. In the Sumerian myth, Enki impregnates a series of his daughters. The Sumerian writer puts Enki's semen everywhere, no pun intended. This ensures that the goddesses did not originate from another god. The Sumerian text emphasizes that Enki was all alone, so that there was no possibility of another god impregnating the goddesses. But biblical writers rarely seem to delete characters altogether. Rather, they repurpose them in the story. So I was wondering if the Sumerian writer did the same. One possibility is Izmud. Izmud is repeatedly made to be inferior to Enki by making him the servant of Enki. And then the text seemed to shift what Izmud did over to Enki. Izmud navigated, but Enki sailed. Izmud named the honey plant, but Enki ate it. This brings us to our next propaganda technique, which I call a plausible misunderstanding. Oh, you thought Izmud sailed the ship? No. Izmud navigated. Enki sailed the ship. Oh, you thought Izmud named the honey plant? No. He just picked it for Enki. For the original reader, this creates the possibility that they may have heard the oral tradition wrong, and that the text is actually right. Izmud naming the plants is similar to Adam naming the animals in the biblical narrative. We are told 3 times in the same paragraph that it is Adam that named them. This is an example of a propaganda technique that I refer to as the redundant lie. This is when the biblical author unnecessarily repeats a claim in order to change the narrative. One example in the Sumerian text is when it talks about Dilmun being pure and virginal. Much of the first part of the text is devoted to explaining how there was nothing in Dilmun before Enki arrived. We have something similar in the Garden of Eden narrative when it talks about how there was no vegetation before Yahweh Elohim made it rain. If you'd like to know who did make the vegetation grow, be sure to check out my video on the Garden of Eden oral tradition. This redundant lie technique shows up in the Sumerian text when the author places emphasis on Enki's semen. We are repeatedly told that it is Enki's semen that impregnates the goddesses, thereby indicating that this was a change in the narrative. We have the opposite of this technique in Genesis 38:9, when Onan spills his semen on the ground, thereby eventually tying Tamar's offspring directly with Judah. Another propaganda technique I call time shifting. This is when an author moves an event in the narrative to a different part of the narrative. In the oral tradition, Isaiah was called a man of unclean lips at the end of his failed ministry. The biblical author moves this phrase to the beginning of his ministry. Similarly, in the oral tradition, Amos says that he is no prophet at the end of his failed ministry. The biblical author moves us to the beginning of his ministry. Lena Einhorn has an interesting theory that the ministry of Jesus was shifted from the 50s to the 30s. This dovetails nicely with my own theory, in that because he shifted Jesus from the 50s to the 30s, the biblical authors needed an oral tradition about a Jesus during that time. They combined the identity of Jesus with a Jesus who was a despised tax collector during that time. The next propaganda technique is the literal figurative switcheroo. This is when the author takes something literal in the oral tradition and makes it figurative in the text. Examples from the Bible include an actual king's feast becoming like a king's feast. Naaman's flesh, who was a child, becomes like the flesh of a child. Eve, who was a goddess, becomes like a god. In the same way, Enki becomes like a gardener, dressing up in a costume and carrying the produce of a gardener. This is done so that he can impregnate yet another goddess. It was Ninhursaja that created the plants. The Sumerian writer needed to inject Enki into this creation process. This is done by having Ninhursaja remove the semen from the thighs of Utu, and then planting that semen in the ground. There is also an instance where a fox is able to speak, and Enki promises to erect 2 birch trees and honor the fox. This fox was likely a god, and the 2 trees were likely worship sites for that god. But the Sumerian text just re-explains these things as regular fox and regular trees. We have something similar in Genesis when it talks about the serpent being able to speak. In the oral tradition, the serpent was also a god. We also see trees being repurposed later in Genesis in honor of Yahweh. In the oral tradition, it was Ninhursaja that created gods and goddesses, but Enki is injected into this process by having them created out of parts of his body that are puns on the names of the god and goddesses. The most interesting instance is when she creates Ninti out of one of Enki's ribs. This, of course, reminds us of the Garden of Eden narrative, when the woman is created out of the rib of Adam. Because of this, some speculate that the Genesis narrative pulls directly from the Sumerian myth. This seems unlikely since it would presuppose an extraordinary knowledge of Sumerian by a Hebrew writer. Some scholars suggest a blind motif in that the rib and life connection became part of the culture, and the biblical author pulled from this. Dr. Kip Davis and Dr. Josh Bowen have an interesting discussion on myth vision about this topic. I would differ only slightly from their views by placing an oral tradition between the blind motif and the Genesis narrative. I had become interested in this rib-life connection because I wanted to see, did the Sumerian author use the same propaganda technique as the biblical author? The answer to this seems to be yes. Both narratives use a rib to change the origin of a goddess. We don't see it in the biblical narrative because we don't see the oral tradition, but in the oral tradition, Eve was a goddess. In the Sumerian myth, the goddess who was created from the rib, Ninti, was also called the Lady of Life. Eve also sounds like life in Hebrew, and in another Sumerian myth, it seems to be trying to move Ninti away from that Lady of the Life title and instead calling her Lady of the Month. This is very similar to moving Eve away from her goddess status to become purely human instead. The last line in Enki in Ninhursaja is "Praise be to Father Enki." I think this encapsulates the purpose of the text very well. It is from Enki that the goddesses originated from. Alright, that's it for today. Please like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.